So I want us to wind up on the discussion we started yesterday, yeah? Was it yesterday or the day before yesterday? We discussed weighted average cost of capital. So I went through the weighted average cost of capital. Today I want to talk about weighted marginal cost of capital and how to arrive at the weighted marginal cost of capital. There's obviously a distinction between the two. Last class, I talked about weighted average cost of capital, which is an average cost of existing funds in the firm's capital structure, an average cost of existing. I think I emphasized that point, that in the company's existing capital structure, there could be existing funds in that capital structure, existing ordinary share capital, existing reserves, existing preference share capital. So the average cost of those existing funds is what we are calling weighted average cost of capital. And I went further to say that market value weights are preferred. When establishing weighted average cost of capital, it's advisable to use market value weights. Now, there is also another overall cost of capital known as weighted marginal cost of capital. Now, marginal cost is cost of new funds. If a company wants to raise additional capital, then that cost incurred is marginal cost. If additional funds or other new funds are to be obtained from more than one source, maybe through the issue of new shares, through the issue of new preference shares, through the issue of new ordinary shares, through the issue of new debentures, then the average cost of raising additional capital from more than one source is known as weighted marginal cost of capital. So it's important that we appreciate that weighted average cost of capital is an average cost of existing funds in the firm's capital structure. Weighted marginal cost of capital, on the other hand, is an average cost of additional funds. So a distinction between the two. Weighted average cost of capital is worked out using market value weights, but the weighted marginal cost of capital shall be worked out using book value as weights. We shall use book value weights. But if the capital structure of the firm is optimal, then the optimal proportions should be used as weights. Where the firm has an optimal capital structure, then the optimal proportions in the firm's capital structure, the optimal proportions in the firm's capital structure should be used as weights. In the notes which I shared with you, I've explained that. I'm sure if you have been reading through the document, I want to believe that you guys have seen what I'm talking about. In the document that I shared yesterday, so this is a document which you already have, and we have been discussing. I stopped at the computation of the weighted marginal cost of capital. How do we arrive at the weighted marginal cost of capital? You can see I've already explained what I've been talking about. It's about additional funds. Marginal cost is about raising additional funds. If additional funds are raised from more than one source, then the average cost of raising additional funds from more than one source is referred to as weighted marginal cost of capital. If you look at the second paragraph, that is the point I've been emphasizing, that where the firm's capital structure is optimal, then additional finance should be raised in proportion to the optimal proportions. Additional finance should be raised in proportion to the optimal proportions in the firm's capital structure. This is done to avoid the change in the optimal proportions. If the optimal equity proportion is 50%, then it should not change. If the optimal debt proportion is 30%, then it should not change. If the optimal preference share capital proportion is 20%, then it should not change. The only way that can be attained is by raising additional capital in proportion to the optimal proportions. If equity proportion is 50%, and 50% of additional capital must come from equity. If 30% is the optimal proportion of debt, then 30% of additional funds must come from debt, and so forth and so on. Now, when a company wants to obtain new capital through the issue of shares or the issue of debentures or issue of preference shares, they incur flotation costs. Now, those costs which a firm will incur when raising new capital, we call them flotation costs. You see, ordinary shares can be issued to raise additional capital, and a firm will incur flotation costs, maybe marketing, the cost of preparing prospectus, and so forth and so on. The same thing applies to preference shares. If a firm wants to raise new capital through the issue of preference shares, it could incur flotation costs. Same thing applies to debentures. When a firm wants to issue new debentures, it again incur flotation costs. Now, sometimes a firm can incur discount costs. If new shares are issued at a discount, ordinary or preference shares are issued at a discount, and that gives rise to discount cost. Now, when computing weighted marginal cost of capital, these costs, flotation costs, discount costs, should be subtracted from the market price of the security. If it is ordinary shares, then when computing the cost of ordinary share capital, you have to deduct flotation costs and deduct discount cost from the market price. If a firm is issuing debentures, then you have to deduct any discount costs, all of flotation costs, when establishing the after-tax cost of the debenture capital. Same thing applies to preference shares. So we didn't see this when we were going through weighted average cost of capital, because that was an average cost of existing funds in the firm's capital structure. But now that we're dealing with the new capital, then such costs feature when computing the cost, the component items. Now, when you compute the weighted marginal cost of capital, the process is the same. You have to get the cost of the new ordinary share capital, the cost of the new venture capital, the cost of the new preference share capital, and then use the optimal proportions or other target proportions are used as weights in arriving at the weighted marginal cost of capital. But otherwise, computational procedure is the same. There's an example that I've already shared here that says Rainbow Limited is considering raising additional finance of shillings 40 million to finance an expansion program that is expected to generate additional net cash flow of 3.5 million each year in perpetuity. So the question says additional funds. Company is thinking of raising additional funds. Capital structure which is optimal is given as follows. Please note, we are talking of optimal. Capital structure which is considered optimal. Ordinary share capital, 50 million reserves, 10 million, 10% debenture, 5 million, 15% preference shares, 15 million. One thing that you need to remember is that ordinary share capital and reserves collectively is equity. Ordinary share capital and reserves collectively is equity. So if you take 50 plus 10, that is 60 million, divided by 100 million times 100, that should be 60%. That is the optimal equity proportion. Optimal equity proportion. Ordinary share capital plus reserves. 60 divided by the total times that is 60%. Debenture capital, if you take 25 million divided by 100 times 100, that is 25%. 25% is optimal proportion of debenture capital. Preference share capital, 15 divided by 100 times 100, that becomes 15%. So what you can see, ladies and gentlemen, is that the optimal equity proportion is 60%. Optimal debt proportion, 25%. Optimal preference share capital proportion, 15%. I hope you can see that. When I talk about proportion, what I mean are those percentages. Now that the capital structure is optimal, then such optimal proportion should not change. That means that additional finance must be raised in proportion to those optimal proportions. I've already said equity proportion is 60%. This company wants to raise 40 million. So 60% of 40 million must come from equity, which is how much? 60% of 40 million is what? The optimal equity proportion is 60%, which must be maintained. So 60% of additional capital must come from equity. How much should come from equity?
24 million.
24 million must come from equity. Yeah? Now, the optimal debt proportion is 25%. I took 25 divided by 100, that is 25%, or 40 million must come from the issue of a new debenture. How much will come from the issue of a new debenture? 25% of 40 million. How much will come from the issue of a new debenture?
10 million.
10 million, eh? How about through the issue of new preference shares? The optimal proportion of preference share capital is what? 15%, eh? So 15% of 40 million, how much should come from the issue of new preference shares?
6 million.
6 million. You see, this company will have raised the 40 million shillings. That's the point I was making, that where the capital structure is optimal, additional funds must be raised in proportion to the optimal proportions so as not to change the capital structure. Farms management have established that 2 million will be raised from internal sources to finance the expansion program. Obviously, that's retained earnings. Now, 60%, we saw that 60% of 40 million is 24, the total from equity. But 2 million will come from internal sources through retained earnings. That means the other 22 million shall come from the issue of new ordinary shares. So farm management have established that 2 million will be raised from internal sources to finance the expansion program. The farm can issue new ordinary shares at 50 shillings each to raise additional external equity. New ordinary shares can be issued at 50 each to raise additional external equity. The most recent dividend paid by the company is 2. However, future dividend will grow at 5% per annum in perpetuity. So you remember that formula for getting the cost of ordinary share capital in a situation where dividend will grow. Flotation costs of 10% of the issue price will be incurred. So see, when you're talking about additional capital, the farm will incur flotation costs, 10% of the issue price. I think if you look at the question, the issue price is 50. 10% of 50, that is 5 shillings, which must be deducted from 50 when computing the cost of ordinary share capital. But when computing the cost of retained earnings, we don't deduct flotation costs because retained earnings does not attract flotation costs. New 8% debentures can be issued at a price of 100 each. Flotation cost of 10 per unit will be incurred. Yeah, so that flotation cost should be deducted from that price when computing the after-tax cost of the debenture capital. New 7% preference shares will be issued at a price of 25 each, subject to flotation cost of 2 per share. The par value of each share is 24. So you see, then again, the flotation cost must be deducted from the share price. Corporation tax rate is 30%. Determine weighted marginal cost of capital. Advise on whether the company should undertake the proposed project. Now, I've already told you, ladies and gentlemen, that weighted marginal cost of capital is an average cost of raising new capital. Where new capital is raised from more than one source, then the average cost of raising funds from more than one source is referred to as weighted marginal cost of capital. The question was very clear. Capital structure of the farm is optimal. And because of that, I told you the first thing to do is to establish the optimal proportions in this capital structure. Equity optimal proportion is 60%. Debt optimal proportion is 25%. Preference share capital, optimal proportion is 15%. So you can see that is the first working I've done. Optimal capital structure proportions. Equity, 60%, debt, 25%, preference share capital, 15%. Now, we need to look at the cost of raising additional finance. Before we go on to that, I think it's important that you guys confirm how additional finance will be raised. How will this additional finance will be raised? This is the working I've done here. The company thinking of raising 40 million, 60% of 40 million should come from equity. That is 24 million. I think we confirmed that. 60% of 40 million, 24 million will come from equity capital. But the question says, management have established that 2 million will be obtained internally. When you looked at this question here, I think it is very clear down here. Firm's management have established that 2 million will be raised from internal sources to finance this expansion program. So 24 million will come from equity, but 2 million will come from internal sources through retention. So equity capital, 60% of 40 million, that should be 24 million. But out of this, okay, so 24 million will come from equity. The total from equity is 24 million. But remember, equity is external equity and there is internal equity. There is external equity and there is internal equity. So internal equity is retained earnings, 2 million. Issue of ordinary shares, 22 million. So the total is 24. So please take a note here. Total from equity is 24 million, but broken down now into internal equity, 2 million, external equity, 22 million. Issue of the new 15% debenture, 25% of 40 million, which is 10 million. Issue of the new 10% preference shares, 15% of 40 million, which is 6 million. And this company will have raised 40 million. If you confirm 2 plus 22 plus 10 plus 6, this firm will have raised their 60 million. So the average cost of raising the 40 million from various sources is what we refer to as weighted marginal cost of capital. So we have to start by establishing how the new capital will be raised. We can now see retained earnings 2 million, issue of new ordinary shares 22 million, issue of the new 15% debenture 10 million, issue of the new 10% preference share 6 million, the total is 40. If you take 2 retained earnings now, 2 million divided by 40 should be how much? Can you confirm? If you take 2 million divided by 40, does it give you 0.05?
Yes.
If you take 22 million divided by 40, does it give you 0.55?
Yeah.
If you take 10 million divided by 40, does it give you 0.25?
Yes.
And if you take 6 million divided by 4, does it give you 0.15?
It does.
Correct. Now, those are the weights now to use. When we are establishing weighted marginal cost of capital, we shall take the cost of retained profit times WR. The cost of ordinary share capital times 0.55. The cost of the new 15% debenture times 0.25. The cost of the new 10% preference share capital times 0. So what we need to do is to work out the cost of these new elements of raising additional capital. The 4 items of raising additional capital: retained earnings, issue of ordinary shares, issue of the new 15% debentures, and the issue of the new 10% preference shares. We need to work out the cost of those 4 elements and then use those weights, these weights here, to find the weighted marginal cost of capital. These are the workings which I've done. Now you're working number 2, cost of retained earnings. That formula we used yesterday, because we are told dividends shall grow at a constant rate. So cost of retained earnings is D naught in bracket 1 plus G divided by P naught plus G. We don't factor in discount costs, and we don't factor in flotation costs when computing the cost of retained earnings. The reason is because retained earnings does not attract flotation costs. So from the question, the most recent dividend is 2 shillings, expected to grow at 5%, divided by 50, the share price, plus the growth rate, 0.05% times 100. Can you please confirm that that's 9.2%? From the question, we know D naught is 2, expected to grow at 5%. So 2 in bracket 1 plus 5% divided by 50. Kwanza hiyo pata hiyo jibu 2 times 1.05 divided by 50 plus 0.05, then the whole of that times 100. Does it give you 9.2%? Cost of retained profit. Does it give you 9.2%?
Yes, it does.
Aya, sawa. Cost of ordinary share capital, we'll use the same formula because you remember retained profit and ordinary share capital is equity. Retained profit is internal equity, ordinary share capital is external equity. So if dividend will grow, then we shall use the same formula, except ordinary share capital, we have to deduct flotation costs and deduct discount costs from the share price. Angalia your formula vile imebadilika. D naught 1 plus G over P naught minus F plus G. This question was saying up here, flotation costs of 10% of the issue price will be incurred. Issue price is 50. So we have taken 10% of 50. 10% of 50, which is 5. Also, ukikuja hapa chini, you'll say 2 is the dividend, 1 plus G% divided by 50 minus 5, flotation costs. Whatever answer you find, plus 0.05, and then multiply by 100. Does it give you 9.7%? Cost of ordinary share capital? You know, Apatia? 9.7%? You please confirm the answer.
Napata 9.66.
So you're on 7 to 9.66, roughly 9.7?
Yeah.
Okay. So you notice the difference, when computing the cost of retained earnings and the cost of ordinary share capital. Because both of them are equity, we use the same formula, except ordinary share capital, you deduct flotation costs and you deduct any discount costs if it were there. Now, after tax cost of the new 15% debenture capital, remember debenture capital, we have to get the after tax costs. That formula we used yesterday, KDT is interest in bracket 1 minus T divided by market value of a debenture less flotation costs. But I'll take note that flotation costs should be deducted from the market value of that item. So if you look at this question, down here, it says new 8% debentures can be issued. New, that's what we are interested in, not existing. Ukiangalia kwa capital structure, we have a 14% debenture. that capital structure. That's an existing item. We are only interested with new items, new. We're establishing the cost of raising new capital. So new 8% debenture can be issued at a price of 100, subject to a flotation cost of 10 shillings per unit. Par value of each unit is 100. So 8% times par value of 100, we close the bracket, 1 minus corporation tax rate, divided by price of 100 minus flotation cost of 10. That's how you take the coupon rate, the rate of interest, which is fixed, times par value of 100, in bracket 1 minus 0.3, divided by market price of 100, remove flotation costs, times 100. Does it give you 6.2%? Please confirm again. Inakupatia 6.2%, wenzangu. In the formula, I is interest. Interest is the rate of interest times the par value. Rate of interest is 8% times par value of 100, which is 8. Then, of course, 1 minus T. 1 is a constant, T is corporation tax, divided by market value of the debenture, which is 100, deduct 10. Does it give us 6.2%?
Yes.
Cost of the new debenture capital? Unapata 6.2.
Yeah.
Hizi formulas tafadhali mziweke kwa fingertips, eh?
Okay.
Tafadhali mjaribu mweke kwa fingertips, eh? Sawa sawa? Hiyo formulas, hii topic itakuja kwa mtihani tu. Hii topic cost of capital ikosangi. Simeona every time uko mtihani. Every time. Either weighted average cost of capital or weighted marginal, eh? One of those. One of those ideally will be set, eh? Mkiangalia kwa question paper, kuna sitting kweli cost of capital imekosekana. Mkiangalia every sitting iko either weighted average ama weighted margin. Tafadhali hizo formula muweke kwa fingertips mzuri. Now, cost of the new 10% preference share capital. Hiyo formula bado KP is equal to DP over MVP times 100. But I think I should have said MVP minus flotation cost, eh? Pia kuna flotation cost hapo, nilisahau kidogo hapo. Sasa DP is dividend. Preference dividend. Ukiangalia kwa swali, angalia hapo chini, nasema new 7% preference shares. Ukienda kwa capital structure, there's an existing. Those existing becomes relevant when you're dealing with weighted average cost of capital. Kama weighted marginal, tafadhali angalia new elements. So new 7% preference shares. You see the coupon rate is 7. If you take 7% of par value, dividend is the rate times par value, the face value. Ukichukua 7% of 24 ni ngapi? 7% of 24. Hiyo ni dividend, preference dividend, eh? Mnapata ngapi wenzangu?
1.68.
7% of 24 inakuwa ngapi?
1.68.
Hiyo ni dividend. Now, dividend divided by the price. The issue price, which is 25, less flotation cost. So the dividend over price of 25 less flotation costs times 100. So you take the rate of dividend payment times par value of 24 divided by 25 minus 2. Inakuwa 7.3%. Mnapata 7.3.
Yes.
Mnapata 7.3%.
Yeah.
Sawa. Now, remember, this company was raising how much money? It's thinking of raising 40 million using 4 sources, Sindio?
Mm.
That is retained earnings, issue of ordinary shares, issue of new 15% debentures, issue of new 10% preference shares. Sasa tumefanya a working for the cost of retained earnings. Tulipata ngapi cost of retained earnings? 9.2, Sindio?
Yes.
You multiply by the weight of retained earnings. Ilikuwa ngapi? 0.05, Sindio? So nakumbuka hapa mahali tulianzia hizi weights.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
Then the cost of ordinary share capital tumepata ngapi? 9.7%. Multiply by the weight of ordinary share capital, 0.05.
Mm.
The cost of the new 15% debenture, ndio hii tumepata hapa, 6.2 times the weight of that debenture, 0.25. Then the cost of the new preference share capital, 7.3 times the weight of preference share capital. Hii tulipata hapa, 0.15. So weighted marginal cost of capital is equal to KS times WS, KR. Then now you multiply each of those component items times those weights, the target weights, the optimal proportions, ones which are used as weights. Also ukishapata those costs, hizo vitu vile tumepata na hizo weights, mnakumbuka vile tulipata. So the weighted marginal cost of capital becomes 8.44%. That is the average cost of raising additional 40 million shillings. Do you find 8.44? Can you confirm that the answer is correct? Ukimultiply hizo costs na hizo weights, unapata jibu ngapi? Unapata jibu ngapi? 8.44%?
Yeah.
That is what we call the weighted marginal cost of capital. Now, if you look at this question, why was the company raising this capital? Ukiangalia kutoka huko mwanzo, Rembo Limited is considering raising additional funds of 40 million to finance an expansion program that is expected to generate additional net cash flow of 3.5 million each year in perpetuity. The reason why the company is raising this capital is to finance a project. That project is expected to generate 3 million each year in perpetuity. So the cost of the project should be 40 million. If the cost of the project is 40 million, and this project will generate 3.5 million each year in perpetuity, is it possible to determine the net present value of the project? Is it possible to get the net present value of the project? Hii ndio tunaulizwa number 2 hapo. Advise on whether the company should undertake the proposed project or not. So we want to compute the net present value of the project. The 3.5 million is a perpetual annuity, Sindio? How do we discount a perpetual annuity? How do we establish the sum of the present value of a perpetual annuity? Unakumbuka? You remember how to discount a perpetual annuity? That is a formula. You take annuity divided by R% minus initial cost. So the annuity is 3.5 million divided by the discounting rate, the one we have worked out. Discounting rate is the weighted marginal cost of capital of 8.44%. In any case, I told you that one of the applications of cost of capital is to make investment decisions. Okay? Cost of capital is used to make capital investment decisions. So the 8.44 is the one that we're going to use to appraise projects. So if you take 3.5 million divided by 8.44% minus 40 million, net present value is 1,469,194.
Yes.
Huh?
Yeah.
I think the point I wanted to put across to you is that cost of capital is used to appraise projects. Mnakumbuka for capital budgeting, you are given the cost of capital, isn't it? When computing the net present value, computing the internal rate of return, you are given the cost of capital. Now, in this case, you have to look for that cost of capital. Sawa sawa, wenzangu. Now, there are certain main differences between weighted average cost of capital and weighted marginal cost of capital. Let me point out a few. One is that weighted average cost of capital is an average cost of existing funds in the firm's capital structure. Weighted marginal cost of capital is an average cost of incremental funds. Are we together? Are we together there?
Yeah.
Weighted average cost of capital is an average cost of existing what? Existing funds. Weighted marginal cost of capital is an average cost of new funds. Okay. Number two, that's one difference. The other difference is that weighted average cost of capital should be determined preferably using market value as weights. Weighted marginal cost of capital should be determined using book values as weights. However, if the capital structure is optimal, then the optimal proportions are used as weights. I'm saying weighted average cost of capital should be determined preferably using market values as weights. Market values. Weighted marginal cost of capital should be determined using book values as weights. If the capital structure is optimal, then optimal proportions should be used as weights. Number three, weighted average cost of capital should be used to appraise existing projects. What I mean is that weighted average cost of capital is used as a discounting rate in the appraisal of existing projects. Weighted marginal cost of capital should be used as a discounting rate when appraising new projects. Kama hii tumefanya sahi, it's a new project where we have used 8.44% as a discounting rate to evaluate the new project. WACC, evaluating existing projects. WMCC, evaluating new projects. Finally, flotation costs and the discount costs don't feature in the calculation of weighted average cost of capital. Last time when I was computing weighted average cost of capital, hamukuona mambo ya flotation costs and discount costs. Now, when computing weighted marginal cost of capital, flotation costs and discount costs feature in the computation of the cost of the component items. Usually, very common in exams. Nimeiona very, very common in exams, ladies and gentlemen. So this is what I wanted to discuss. You guys can now fall back to your past papers and confirm if there is anything that you can do on the computation of weighted marginal cost of capital. Naona tuko watu 15. It's a good number. Mnaweza ingia kwa past papers zenu mfanya kidogo sasa. Ian Karaoke, are you there?
Yes.
Tumeelewana kidogo? So, tumeelewana?
Yes.
Galaxy, tumeelewana? Kuna Galaxy 111 sasa sijui ni nani.
Yes.
Tumeelewana kidogo?
Tumeelewana.
Mkienda kwa past papers mnaweza angalia maswali kidogo mfanye bwana.
Neza.
Hii topic, please take care. Cost of capital is very common in exams. If the examiner don't set on weighted average cost of capital, they will set on weighted marginal. Tafadhali muiangalie mzuri. Kama kuna issues, munieleze. Sawa sawa?
Sawa.
Na working capital mnaendelea mzuri na mwalimu? Nimeona ana is meeting you again. The two, Management of working capital, I requested mwalimu anisaidie. Mnaendelea bado
Yes.
Tafadhali muangalie sana hizo I discussed working capital. I discussed working capital financing policy in class before I fell sick na nikaondoka. Working capital operating cycle, management of stock, management of debtors, management of cash. Hizo vitu msikize mzuri mwalimu akiongea Sawa wenzangu?
Sawa.
Hiyo management of stock. Muangalie mzuri economic order quantity model, just in time system of inventory control. Hiyo ukienda kwa cash management, BAMOLS model, mirror all model, cash budgets. Ukienda kwa debtors management, appraisal of how to evaluate credit policies, advising whether you should change the terms of sale or not. Nyinyi soma na mwalimu. I'll pick some questions we revise. Your working capital. Sawa sawa? Mwalimu asaidie mmalize. Nitatafuta maswali kidogo kidogo tufanye pamoja. But please take note of those things. Kama ni cash, your cash budget, BAMOLS model, Miller or model. Ukienda kwa inventory management, economic order quantity, especially economic order quantity. Hiyo msikize mzuri vile mwalimu anawapeleka na hiyo management of debtors. Sawa. Is there any pressing issue?
Mwalimu, I have a request.
Yes.
Kindly share the Word document to our WhatsApp group.
Oh,
the one that I've been using to lecture.
Oh, see, kwa Moodle.
Okay, not everyone has access to the module, so
I know a number. I think I know a number of you here. Kuna wale who are capable. There are those who are capable of sharing these notes there. Is there anybody in this class? I'm sure, Ian, there are quite a number of guys here who can help. Simusaidiane bwana. Kama mtu hawezi ingia kwa Moodle, kuna wale wanajua vile wanatoa hapo, wanaleta kwa WhatsApp. Simusaidiane. I know you guys can do that, isn't it?
Yeah.
Si mnaweza fanya hiyo? Huh? That's a small exercise. I know you guys, surely you should be able to do. Ufanya. Sijui kama huyu ameuliza ni wa fundamentals of finance.
No, CPA.
CPA. Which class? Town campus?
Part-time campus.
Oh, kujioni, eh?
Yes.
Okay. Now what you do, kuna wale wako hapa hivi who can do this. Anybody who can volunteer to help us, please?
I can, but I'm in TD.
What you do, just do it, send it to your wall. Now I'll get it and send it to the
Okay.
wall for the part-time class.
Okay.
Sawa, but unajua sifai kuongea sana hata sasa nasikia nimechoka kidogo. Now, unajua tukiangalia sana wale wanafanya ATD, syllabus yenu ni kama inaisha. Sio kama umeona hivyo. Wale mfanya ATD, after working capital management, unajua syllabus imeisha. I'm hoping you guys are reading on Islamic finance. I gave you a handout, Wadhali hiyo mjisomee, both CPA and ATD, Islamic finance, jaribu kujisomea. After working capital management, those in ATD watakuwa tumemaliza syllabus yenu itakuwa imeisha. Those who are doing CPA, after working capital management, which mwalimu is doing, cost of capital, and nimefanya, kuna valuation, which valuation is for CPA, ATD is not there in the syllabus. I gave you a very good document, but that valuation, those who are doing CPA, discuss pamoja, malize valuation. Then I gave you a handout on ratios, financial ratios, tafadhali pitia na forecast.